We are not built to live in survival mode. Our bodies need safety. Our brains need rest.
Rick Doblin is the founder of MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. He did it in the 80s because he wanted to become a psychedelic therapist himself the moment MDMA became illegal. So he tried to create an institutional entity to make it possible again. And 35 years later, MDMA is now in phase 3 study for PTSD. He will tell you everything about this. One thing maybe I would like to mention is that an article on the MAPS blog from 2006 from Andrew Sewell was the inspiration for us in the beginning to create the first student association in Switzerland. So if we are here today, it's also really because of Rick Doblin and his awareness work. So thank you so much.
So it has been now 36 and a half years since I've started MAPS. And just to have a touch point in Switzerland, this is around 40 years ago, almost. This is me and Albert Hoffman. And the reason I'm showing this, I wanted to mention that it was a few years after that Albert came to Esalen for the meetings in 1985 when we were planning how to protect the therapeutic use of MDMA. So it's now been 36 years of psychedelic science through MAPS, April 8th, 1986. And this was after we actually had won the lawsuit against the DEA. The judge said it should MDMA should be available as a medicine, illegal for recreational use, but available as a medicine. And the DEA administrator rejected that recommendation and kept criminalizing it. So that's where I had to start MAPS. This is the MAPS logo as interpreted by Alex Gray. And the important thing here is that the hands are first and the psychedelic imagery is in the background. And so what this really emphasizes is that it's about therapy. The psychedelics help the therapy be more effective, but the treatment itself is primarily thought of as psychotherapy. It's not that you give the drug and people automatically get better. It's not like a traditional psychiatric drug. You take it every day on your own. This is only you take a few times under direct supervision of therapists. And again, it's people helping people that will be the primary active ingredient in helping people overcome PTSD and many other things. What does the therapy itself look like? It's an alliance between the therapist and participants. The therapeutic alliance is the key factor. This empathic rapport and presence. We support the participant's own healing process, emphasis on preparation and integration and trust in the process. The key point here is that we see ourselves as trying to help people learn how to heal themselves. We're facilitating their own healing process, but they have to do the hard work. The direction of the session sourced from the participants' experiences. It's not like we overlay on top of it. Here's our structure. Here's cognitive behavioral therapy. Here's prolonged exposure. Here's our techniques. Here's our exercises. It's not that. We support what's ever emerging from each person. And it's this inner-directed therapeutic approach, this belief that there's this inner healing intelligence, and we support it as it emerges in whatever kind of order that it comes. So,
people often say, logically, how come you're not combining it with another specific established therapy? And I'll comment on that in a minute, but I will say now people are beginning to do that. We actually did a pilot study with couples with Candace Monson and Ann Wagner using cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy with MDMA. So, they had good data on that method. And so we're testing that. Barbara Rothbaum in Atlanta is studying MDMA with cognitive behavior, prolonged exposure therapy. So people are beginning to test that. That's great. And there's some people that want to do studies with IFS, internal family systems therapy, with or without MDMA.
Mhm.
Makes a lot of sense. I'm enthusiastic about seeing what they find. At the same time, one of the things I find most fascinating is when we take this relatively non-directive approach, or we often call it inner-directed approach, where we don't set out to do any specific kind of therapy, but we encourage the participant and the therapist to not have it, as much as possible, not have an agenda, and encourage people to just see what they discover. And then we work with what comes up. And I think what's so interesting about that is many of these elements of other therapies come up spontaneously, but at different times, in different orders, in different ratios for each person. So we did find that in active doses of MDMA, almost 80% of people end up talking about parts and doing IFS kind of stuff. Whereas with the inactive doses, it's around less than 25%. So there's something about MDMA that seems to stimulate awareness of parts and more self-energy. Likewise, people end up doing prolonged exposure, imaginal exposure at some point, even though we don't tell them to. People recognize their cognitive distortions, even though we don't set out to do cognitive behavioral therapy. People talk about the transference and psychodynamic stuff, and things come up in the body. All these different aspects of various different kinds of therapies seem to come in a kind of a unique combination for each person. And to me, that's very appealing, the idea of not getting ahead of the experience with an agenda and just see what you might discover. Because if you set out to do a certain kind of therapy, that can be useful, but you don't know what unexpected thing might come. Because so often we see somebody having an experience that we weren't expecting that turns out to be just so powerful for their healing.